Get started. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to part 2 of Dynamic Techniques in Power BI. We're going to let the users drive. Just a few things about me before we get started. My name is Robin. I'm a senior consultant at Pragmatic Works. I live in the Pacific Northwest, not too far outside Portland, and I have great views of Mount Hood not too far from my front door. Dynamic reporting. It seems like a lot of you haven't had a lot of experience with dynamic reporting, but it's not really a very difficult thing to get your head around. We're going to do that in this session. In the first presentation of the series, I don't know how many of you saw it, but we discussed basically how users have varying degrees of experience with Power BI so far. It's still a pretty new reporting experience for most users. But when it comes to users, they pretty much all have the same common needs. They just want to see their data presented in a way that allows them to get actionable, usable data that works inside their current workflows. By using dynamic power visualization techniques, we're going to give them a greater control over what they see and how they use it. If a user only cares about what the day's sales figures were from the day before, you can give that to them by letting them choose that in a slicer. But maybe in the same user group, you have someone who's more interested in how did we do compared to the forecasts. In the same exact report, they can look at that data and understand exactly how they're doing. Now, in the past, we used techniques that involved basically creating a ton of parameters and shoving them into SSRS or crystal reports, and then the users would input their specific variables and then wait and wait and wait while those reports filled up with data. We don't have to do that anymore. And if we're lucky, we'll get them to stop using tools like Excel to download all their data into and then create entirely new reports off of the reports that you just created for them. I can't guarantee that. Half of them probably still will do that no matter what you do. But now we can bundle up related data into a single report. And the individual users will find that their needs can be met inside that report if they just go in and utilize it in a way that gives them the same customization that they were getting by downloading and then reshaping the data prior. We can allow them to choose what data points are important to them. And again, they don't have to download and then filter out everything else. And one of the best features of using dynamic visualizations is that by creating one single report that has related data for several different sets of users, they're now looking at a single source of truth. They can talk about the data they've seen in the report. They're not going to be arguing over what the correct number should be. They're all looking at the same exact thing. Now again, Power BI is still new. A lot of these people are just seeing it for the first time or just still getting used to it. They're used to the old school stuff like SSRS, and that wasn't very helpful as far as getting down to exactly what they needed. So they would then ask you to create sub-reports of reports or variations of reports, or they would just download the data from the report into Excel again and then make what they really needed. So by using a dynamic report technique, you're going to be giving them not just better data, but you're going to be teaching them how they can get to their data using a better technology that will give them a greater ability to get right to the actionable data without jumping through a bunch of hoops. Once users understand that, they're going to really, really love what you're doing for them. Now, pretty much at a simple level, we can make a dynamic report out of anything. But if you're using a direct connection data set, instead of doing an import model, there are a few things that you need to be aware of. If you're just making a simple top and bottom visualization, that's fine. You can use either. Slicer tables can get a little bit more complicated, and we'll go over all this in detail later. Don't worry if I'm speaking about things that don't make sense to you yet. They all will eventually. Now, if you're using a direct connection and slicer tables, you're probably going to have to create those in your direct connect model. But if you're using import models, you can do it either way. You can create them in the model and then import them, or you can create them inside the PBIX file. Measures with switch. Again, this is just a measure. You can do it in any model. And I'm going to repeat this over and over again throughout this presentation. Be careful with switch. It can be a wonderful tool, but if used in ways that stretch it a little too much, you're going to really slow your performance down. And unpivoted data, which I think is the best method you can use for really creating a truly dynamic report. And we'll go over this again in detail as we go on. But again, if you're using a direct connect data source, you're going to have to create this unpivoted table inside your direct connect data source. We had a few questions about security in the previous presentation, so I'm going over that right now. As long as you use the methods outlined here, your row-level security will continue to function exactly as it's designed to. Basically, all these techniques that we're pointing at are just pointing to rows in the basic table, so it will continue to use those rows to apply the correct row-level security. Performance, you have to be careful. A dynamic report can be super fast, but overuse of dynamic techniques or use of them in ways that aren't very performant can really slow you down. So always keep an eye on your performance. Because even if a report gives a user just what they need, if it takes a long time, they're going to go back to their Excel. So with all that in mind, let's let the users drive. We're going to use a variety of techniques today. The first are what-if parameters. These are great. These are runtime parameters where your users choose, like for instance, a number of records they want to see, or you may use a different number for something else. It will apply the what-if parameter to whatever data you're looking at and allow the users to control either how much data they're looking at or what data they're looking at based on what you're using it for inside your measures. Again, we'll get into this later. Don't worry if you don't know what a what-if parameter is just yet. Top and bottom records. It's really difficult for a user to look at a giant page of data with all the records on it and instantly narrow down to the actionable items. Most of your managers want to know, what are my biggest concerns? Where are the opportunities to grow or perform better? And they also want to know, what are the big wins for the day or the week or the month? By using top and bottom records, you'll be able to give them that information at a glance, and they'll be able to dynamically choose what they're looking at so that they can find what's important for that next meeting or that next day. Slicer tables, these are what we use to choose which metrics we're going to be looking at. Measures with switch, switch is kind of old school. It's a DEX function inside a measure. And again, these can be really useful in choosing what metrics we're going to look at, but they always have a performance consideration. And then again, the unpivoted data table. And lastly, and this is brand new from the previous presentation, we're going to look at nonlinear date slicers. These are a technique that I both hesitate to teach anyone about, but know that it can be sometimes a lifesaver when you have either a client or an analyst or a manager who wants to compare two date periods that just don't mesh in with what Microsoft offers off the bat. For instance, say they want to compare the first week of the first quarter to the first week of the third quarter. Now that's not something you would normally see in Power BI, and you might have to write a bunch of stuff to do it. But by creating a non-linear date slicer, and we'll go over this again in techniques, you can actually choose those just into slicers. So they can choose which date period they want to look at, or you can apply them to two different visualizations, one next to the other, just so that they can, at a glance, see what the differences are. And here's an example that is actually from the report we'll be looking at today. As you can see, we have all dates so that they can look at all dates. They can choose Christmas or Thanksgiving. What we're doing in this particular report is we're looking at sales in the 10-day period before Christmas and the 10-day period before Thanksgiving. So that, say for instance, a manager needs to know what to stock. They can look and see what the sales were in the previous years for those two items. Or if someone wants to know what to expect for sales, again, they can check in those days without having to go through a lot of hoops. Now this is the report that we'll be looking at today. It's entirely dynamic. There's nothing on this page that isn't dynamic except for what visualizations are there and what the slicers are. The data that I'm using today is real data. I downloaded it from data.gov. It allows you to answer some real questions that anyone who is running, for instance, in this case, we're talking about liquor stores in Idaho, because that was what I found that was available that had some really good data for us as far as period comparison, which is super important, I think, in this type of data. And you'll be able to answer the real questions that a manager might have dynamically. And as far as this report, it is horribly excessive in its use of dynamic techniques. I can't imagine a real report where you would have every single thing on the page be dynamic. But for our purposes today, you'll be able to see that. Now this is the download link that I used to pull down the data set. If you want to pull it down yourself, warning, it's over 3 gigabytes of CSV. I have dynamically trimmed that down to just a little bit over, I think, 24 megabytes. So we're not looking at this full data set in this report because I wanted you to be able to download and utilize the data that we're talking about today. Data included today is from 2017 to present. When we look at the report, you'll see that Thanksgiving and Christmas for this year are not yet available. And again, for the vendors, I just chose a small subgroup so that we wouldn't be looking at an overload of data. And actually, I've got a better link for you to use. I'll pull that up later. So why this data? It offers us a great opportunity. We're going to compare two high-volume, nonlinear date periods. It's simple. There's not a lot to understand in this data. There's no terms that you won't recognize. It's just basic retail data. And yet, even though it's simple, it's going to mimic a lot of things that you'll get asked for in your day-to-day work. So first, we're going to talk about what-if parameters. These are what we use to basically allow people to choose how many records they want to look at. So instead of just giving them a top 5 or a top 10, they can have a top however many they want. And this is one of my favorite things that they added. I guess it was either last year or the year before. But basically, you give it a name and make sure that the name is something that's useful for you so you know what it's being used for. You choose a minimum and a maximum, which can be any number, in an increment that you want the numbers to go up. And you can also add a default. Again, you're going to use this mainly for things like top records, if you're going to use a rank X, which is something we'll look at later. But it allows your users to decide when they want to see it, how many records they want to see, which can be really, really useful for them. And it also can prevent them from asking you to make another report with more or less. And once it's done, you just add to any measures that you want. And now I've included a top-end measure example, which is how you would use that rank X. You would choose, as you see at the top of this, we have a variable called top num, and you're going to choose the selected value in the top records that you just created, and that will be used to determine how many records this returns. I actually included inside the PowerPoint a text file of the measure that we're using in the full file. And this PowerPoint will be available to you along with the files for the data and the PBIX when this presentation is concluded. You'll all have access to it. Now, a fully dynamic top-end measure returns the number of records that we've chosen in the what-if parameter slicer. In our particular example, we're letting it choose whether or not to show the top or the bottom records based on a slicer choice. Some people in some reports may require you to have both of those on a single page, but if they just want to choose which one they want to see, you can actually base that on a slicer choice. In this particular measure, we're ignoring blank values. That's something you may want to do with rank X and top N in some circumstances. In other circumstances, you want to see those blanks. You're going to always want to check with your users and see what their requirement is for that. And again, I have another slicer in here, which you'll see soon, which actually checks what metric we're ranking by. For instance, in this measure, you could choose to rank it based on dollars sales. You could choose to rank it on bottles sold or volume sold. And you can see how that would be useful if someone wanted to know, for instance, if they wanted to see what the forecast was and rank by that, or rank by the difference between the forecast and the sales. There's just a myriad of ways you can compare different values based on slicer choices and allow your users to, at runtime, figure out exactly what those things are they need to work on. And then finally, once you have all the choices in based on just what slicers they've chosen to hit, it returns the top or bottom visualization. And here's an example of a slicer table. As you can see, it's just got categories of data, and you're going to choose which one you want to look at. To create it, you're going to create a new table with the categories. The easiest way to do this is to just hit the Enter Data button. If you only got 4 or 5 choices, it's really easy to just type them in. I will normally also add an index column with just 1, 2, 3, 4, so that you can select what order they show up in. Make sure you add a relationship to your dynamic table, because if you don't, that slicer isn't going to do anything. Then you add the category into a slicer visualization. And here's an example of how that works. Here we have a slicer table that was created for rank by, and basically it's choosing what visuals, what is being shown in the visualization below. It's either going to be by sales, by bottle sold total, or bottle volume total. And the numbers will change depending on which one of those you choose. And another example, and this one is using switch to choose those metrics, and that switch dynamic total is what's populating this visualization. You'll see an example of that too, and there'll be the measure for you to look at. And then lastly, we have the ability to unpivot the data. This is the best thing of all, in my opinion. This is the slice spread of dynamic visualizations. You're going to add a unique index to the fact table before you do anything else if you don't already have one. Now you may have a unique indicator in your fact table. A lot of people don't, so you want to make sure before you do anything else, you got to add that unique index. The next thing you do, and we'll go through this with the file so you'll see it in action, is make a reference copy of your fact table. And all you do to do that is you just right-click on it in the query editor and choose reference from the menu, and it will rename the new query. And then you're going to select the index and the columns you want to turn into categories and just remove the other columns. It's actually a lot simpler than you would think. Now, in some cases, they might want what's called a compound field. Say they want to be able to rank things by sales and color, or maybe they want to rank it by city and state. In order to do that, make sure that you have those two columns in your reference copy. Then all you do is, and we'll do this again, so if you haven't done this before, we'll show you how to do it, is you add a new column and then you combine those two columns, and then they will also act as a slicer together once we're done with this. The next thing we do is we just highlight all the columns except for the index. And the reason I'm showing you all these steps, and you're going to get all these steps in the file once you're done with the presentation, is so that you can follow these directions along as you try it on your own with your own data. You're going to highlight the columns except for the index and just unpivot them. It's that simple. Close and apply. And now you have your new values. Now it'd be great if that did it all, but that doesn't do it all. We also have to create a dynamic column inside our dynamic table. It sounds a lot more complicated than it is, and I'm giving you the calculated column code so that you can replicate this with your own data sets. And basically we're using a switch, and it's a calculated column. Oops. And what I just want you to notice here is the first step on it is the first non-blank of the dimensions attribute, which is the column that gets created when you do that unpivot. And you'll see that in a few minutes. And then you just choose the words that will be in your slicer table, and you choose the related table. It's always going to be related because they're not going to be in that table. And this is why it always uses the row level security, by the way, because it's just looking at your regular tables to get that data. You just choose what it relates to, and Power BI does the rest for you. Then we add relationships. And one thing to note here, and it'll be brought up again in a second, is this double arrow here. When you add this dynamic table, you have to create a both-way relationship, which is something you really never want to do unless you have to, but it's the only way this will work. And then you're going to have a slicer table, or maybe multiple slicer tables, and those will just have a single direction slicer, just like a normal one. Now, because your tables are going to change, they're not going to have the same data in them. You're going to want to name them dynamically as well. And again, we just create another measure. We use a ton of variables based on what you're going to be showing in there. Have a variable for every dynamic element. And then just basically you just return those variables in a way that looks good for your users so they know what they're looking at. To do that, you're going to click on the title and choose Paintbrush. And then you'll click on the little ellipses under the title. And then a little box like this will pop up. And you'll choose Format by Field Value, and you will choose your measure that you just made that has the table name in it. And just by choosing that measure, it will change with their dynamic slicers. And this is what we've created. Now I'm going to pull up the actual file. Let me grab it here. And first we're going to look at the query editor. So you also will have a copy of this, and it's important to note that when you do download it, you're going to want to download into this directory. If you don't make this directory, if you have to put it on another file, you're going to need to go in here and manually edit this C to be whatever it should be in your particular computer. But if we look at the data, we'll just see from the source file is just this sample Idaho data that I provided you with, or will be providing you with. I just go through the normal steps that you would to bring in the data. I promote the headers. I did a little bit of filtering here to make it a little less to work with. Remove the extra columns that I brought in by accident. I went in and I checked that my dates were dates and my integers were integers. If you haven't done this before, if you're new to Power BI, it's just a simple matter of going to, oh wait, I don't think you're seeing this. I'm showing you things that you're not seeing. My apologies. Let's, okay, I'm switching screens. Can someone in chat let me know if you're seeing the Power BI query editor right now? Crystal, you there? Okay, I think you can see it. I'm going to keep going. Okay, so what we have here is the Power Query Editor. Going back to the top, you can see the file that I've created that I put all these in. You'll be able to put your stuff in there too. Promoted the headers, filtered the rows. Add an index file, an index column. The easy way to do this is just to go to add column index and then just choose 1 or 0. So now from that, the really cool thing is we're going to do our pivoted table, which I've called in this case dimensions. If we look at the source, we'll just see it's just the sales table. So we've taken that. Then what I did was I chose the columns I wanted to use for my slicers, and I removed all the other columns by simply choosing them, such as this, and hitting remove other columns, which I'm not going to do right now because these are the ones we need. Now, because we're using a table with a lot of dimension tables in it here, what I've gone and I've done is merged queries. This is a little bit more of a intermediate technique. It's not very hard. To merge a query, all you have to do is go to your top bar, choose merge queries. You will insert a step. It brings up the table you want. And say if I wanted to add the vendor name to this, I would just choose vendor, and vendor number is just like doing a relationship, and then hit OK. And then it will add that to the table. In this case, I merged the stores in there so that I could use them as a slicer. You'll do that through the rest. Now in this one, I've done something to create a combined store info file, column so that they can actually look at the records and combine it based on the store name, the store city, and the store county. And then once I get everything I want in there, I go down to the bottom and I unpivot. Excuse me. I select my index file, or my index column, because I don't want to change that. Index is what connects this to the relationship to the other table. And then what you want to do here is you're going to unpivot other columns. It's as simple as that. Now I also have these other tables that are slicer tables. And here, as you can see, I've just used the enter data. I chose top sales, bottom sales, top and bottom, which is what I'm using in my measure. And then I ordered them by having an index of 1 and 2. It's just a matter of going in and typing in whatever you want in here. And then we also have our holiday table, which is what we're going to use for our non-linear dates. As you can see here, we have a Thanksgiving period and a Christmas period, and then we have the all dates, which is literally every single date from your date table. It's a pain, but if we want to use it in that same way, we have to have every date that we want included in the relationship inside this table. So when I hit close and apply, there shouldn't be anything to apply. Oops. Then it populates this report. As you can see here, we have the dimensions. And as we talked about earlier with the dynamic column, this is what makes it all work. And here we have that switch statement that we looked at earlier. It's basically saying, if category is chosen, show me the related category table, category name, store number, store's store name, etc., etc. And what we did was we created a slicer for each one of these slicer tables up here. And if you watch, I'm going to switch from looking at it by item to category right now. And it just changed. You can look at it by city. It just changes that fast. I can also look at a different year. I can look at less records or more. By being very careful about the data you're using, how you're using it, and being performant in your measures, you can make this kind of dynamic SQL, or not SQL, dynamic DAX actually, work just as quickly as anything else. And as you can see here, we're looking at top 10 sales right now. By clicking this slicer, I switch to bottom 10 sales. And again, this is a measure that we already looked at a little bit, but here it is inside the Power BI. And it's also connected as a text file to the PowerPoint presentation, which you'll be receiving when this presentation is over. If we look at, how are we doing for time? We're doing good. If we look at our relationships, here's where you see the two-way relationships, and they're only used for these dynamic tables. This dynamic table is the holidays table that we used. That's providing the non-linear choices. And this is the dimension table with the dimension dynamic column. Now, speaking of the non-linear dates, right here we're looking at the Thanksgiving period, which I've set up to be 10 days before Thanksgiving. Now, if I was a store manager and I wanted to know what to stock, I can look and see items, I'm going to want to see top, not bottom. I'm going to want to see what my top 10 sales were for items in 2018. I can see them right here for Thanksgiving. Okay, that's what I sold most of before Thanksgiving, but what did I sell before Christmas? And as you can see, that slightly changed. So right there, you have actionable items that your users can make choices on, save the company money, or make a greater profit just by having this available at their fingertips. And with that said, I think we're about ready for questions. Crystal, you here?
I am. Do you want me to read the questions off, or did you want to?
I am. Oh, okay. I see one question already. Let me see if I can get this.
Just right there in the right-hand corner.
Yeah, it's really tiny on my screen. I'm trying to get to it. I did see someone asking if they can get the Power BI, and the answer to that is yes. You will get it. I have the download link for all of you. I can't get this to be larger. It's so tiny.
Are you looking on the panel? Like
Yeah.
on the, okay. The little square and the arrow, if you just hit that button, it will expand out for you.
Oh, there we go. Thank you.
Life-changing, isn't it?
It is life-changing.
And you can like go in the left-hand corners and just stretch the corners if you want to too, to make it even bigger.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah, I have one of those 4K monitors, and I regret it every time I do something like this. So, oh, thank you guys who actually told me that you could see the query editor. Unfortunately, I couldn't see you telling me it. So I just went and assumed you could. Okay, so the first question I see here is, can we get a link to Power BI? And the answer is yes. I'm going to give you that link. And did we post it at the beginning of the webinar,
We did. I'll
Crystal?
repost it in the chat right now for you guys.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
When you download from this link, you're going to get the full presentation that I just gave to you, the Power BI file, and the sample data. So you'll be able to do this all on your own computer, and you'll have instructions that take you through it step by step. If you have any questions, I want you to know that you can email me, and I will get back to you. If I'm at my clients, it might take me a few hours to get back to you, but I will get back to you. Two CSV files are missing from the OneDrive link. Huh. I did not need those when I did mine. I will double check on that, and if we need an update to the OneDrive link, I will do that, and we will get that out to you today. Thanks, David. Oh, I see more than one person telling me that. Okay. I will definitely share those files. Right after this is done, I'm going to ask you to give me about an hour and then just go back to that OneDrive link and re-download, and you will have everything that you need. And I'm still going through the questions. Please bear with me for a second. Crystal wants to know if there's any documentation provided that will go over all the steps to create the tables in Power Query. Well, there are some instructions in the PowerPoint presentation that actually do that, but as well, because I'm providing you with these tables, if I go back to edit queries, let me look here. You have two choices here. One thing that I probably shouldn't recommend, but I will recommend, is if you want to just do, for instance, a date table, between Power BI files, if you're doing a standard date table, you can just copy from here, hit copy, and you can paste it into another Power BI file if you ever want to do that. The second is for each of these tables, you'll see a source. Like most of these metric selections and all the slicer tables, they were all created just from enter data. So there's no script there or anything. I've just gone in and I've typed in what was used. In this case, I gave it a dimension column name that matched what was in the regular tables. And I added a selection index so I could order it in the correct way. And you can see all of these just by going to applied steps and clicking on the little gear, and it will show you what I did step by step. Here I sorted the rows based on the index. And here I changed the type. So I think you were saying this is the one that was, oh, I see what you're saying. All right, this is what some people asked me a few minutes ago about some files being missing. And I'm going to re-upload all of this so that you get the files you need and so that they're pointed to the same directory, because this is not. This is a really quick fix and something I'll be able to get you within an hour. I have a question if the user is doing all of this or IT prepares the reports. In this case, it would probably be IT that prepares the initial report, but then because there's so many dynamic questions inside the file, the user would be able to take a single report and basically have the functionality of many reports because they're choosing how the data is prepared. So yes, IT does prepare the reports, but it reduces a lot of work because you're not creating as many reports as you would have before. And it's helping the user learn how to see data in the report so eventually they can do their own self-service if that's what you want. And apparently a couple of you tried to use the file anyways because probably before I told you that it was indeed missing some files. So please be a little bit patient and we'll get you the Power BI file with the correct extra files within an hour after I'm off of here. Someone is asking if they need the Power BI service or you can just use the Power BI desktop. For this type of report, you can use either. It doesn't matter. I would recommend if you're sharing with a lot of people to try to use the Power BI service. It's just got a lot of functionality and it's good for a bunch of things, but if you're just sharing between a couple people, you can do that with this, just with the desktop. Another question here, it says, I see that Unpivot lets us enable dynamic dimensions. I've used Switch for dynamic metrics before. Is it possible to combine these two? The answer is yes. And therefore select both the metrics and also dim to slice. The answer is yes. Martin, I think you've actually caught just onto what I was talking about. There's a little bit of both of those in here. If you have further questions about this, please feel free to contact me and I'd be happy to walk you through whatever it is you're trying to do. To a point. Not if it turns into a 2-week consulting assignment. If you want to do that, you have to go through PredMac-Works. Okay, here's another question. I used what if parameter yesterday and it rounds up my value. I actually don't know the answer to that as far as what the default behavior is. If you want to email me, is it Parag? I will definitely be happy to look into that with you and get you an answer to that question. That's a good question. If anybody doesn't give a slicer value and we don't have a default value as well, How do you handle that? That's a good question. In this particular file, I used single choice slicers so that it actually did hit a default, but also inside the measure, let me see if I can pull that up. I will show you how I handled that exact. Inside the sales ranking measure, I think it was where I used that, I used the if is blank, and then I would assign a value to the blank values, just because otherwise you're going to end up with blank tables and no one wants to see a blank table. And I have a few questions asking if I can go through again the unpivot, and I will happily do that. I think we still have a few minutes. We do. So why don't I go back to that? I'm going to go into edit query again. And my dimension table, which is my pivot table. What I've done is for my source for my dimension table, I've just chosen my fact table. And there's a reason I did it as a reference instead of a copy. I want it to update if I update the original table so that we're still looking at the same. I've gone through and chosen what columns I want to see. As you can see, I don't need most of these. So I've just chosen the correct columns, and I always make sure to choose the index as well. In this case, and you don't need to know this for most of what you did, I also added some merge queries to add some extra columns to the table, but for just understanding the basics of it, you can look at this, but the merge queries just aren't that important for understanding basically how this works. Once I had all my columns chosen and I added the extra columns that I wanted, I removed other columns. I chose what columns I wanted to keep, unchecked the other ones, hit OK. A couple of these had some names that were two-part. I wanted the one part, so I just renamed them. Reordered them how I wanted to see them. Excuse me, I'm coughing. And then I unpivoted the columns. Now the way I did that was I clicked on my index file, my index column, excuse me, went into transform. There's an unpivot columns here. And what I did here is not unpivot this column because I want to keep that column, so I unpivoted the other columns. The other way to do that is to select the columns you want to unpivot and select only the selected columns. Either one works the same. But once you do that, what happens is for each index number, I now have 8 rows. And what it did was it took those columns and it put them in as an attribute now. So item and vendor is one row, combined store info is one row, and then I have my values here for this index. So this is basically each 8 rows are one row of my fact table now. And you can go through and look at it and you'll see each index value of the fact table is always going to have 8 rows. And it will always have these values. If there's nothing in one of those values, it will just show as blank. I hope that's a little bit easier to understand. Stefan, I think it is, has asked if I provided all the support documents from part 1, and yes, I did. I can also give you the documents for that, the link for that. Or if you like, what I will do, why not, is I will put them in a folder inside the other folder as well. So you can just download one folder in about an hour from now. Please keep the link that we shared so that you can download from that link. It'll be there in an hour. The question I have here is, can you make a dynamic selections, a dynamic parameter Power Query? The answer to that is no. And I think, let me just check. I think we've gotten through all the questions. And we're just about out of time. We're a couple minutes early. So if anyone has another question, ask it right now. Yeah, I can share the link again. Sure. Okay, you should have just gotten that link again. Again, give me about an hour to populate that with everything that we've just talked about, and then you'll be able to use it. Another question, instead of manipulating the data via Power Query, couldn't we use it during a dynamic table and summarize? Yes, there's a million ways to do this. That is another way to do it. I like using Power Query because it makes for a really fast and easy way to do this, and especially for people who are newer to this. The DAX that you're talking about is a little beyond most beginners and a lot of intermediate people as well. But yeah, that was a great question. Any other questions? Or I'm going to close it out. Again, thank you all for attending. This was a really great session. And if you do have any questions, let me just give you my email address here one more time. There you go. And I will look forward to speaking to you all again in a different topic. Thank you.
All right, Robin, thank you so much for hosting. We really appreciate it. And like Robin stated, you guys will receive the recording tomorrow in your email, as well as the link that she has provided in the chat. I'll make sure that I also put that in the email just for those who are not in here right now and for those who missed it in the chat. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to reach out to Robin or myself. We'll be so happy to help you guys. Thank you guys for attending this webinar, and we hope to see you guys in the next one. And have a good rest of your Tuesday. Thank you again, Robin. We appreciate it.
Thank you. And give me an hour. They'll be there.
Okay. Okay, no problem. No
All
worries.
right. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.